Welcome. Great to have you here. Let me first say a thanks to our friends from MV Transportation because they made the Continental Breakfast available to us and their sponsorship, so thank you, MV. And I want to spend just a couple of minutes with you just briefly recapping a little bit about this current year, which is almost to the end. We got a month ready to go here before we call it 2018 is closed and starting the new year, and then a brief glimpse looking ahead to 2019 and maybe a little bit beyond that as well. First of all, let me just reinforce the notion that, look, we've got a very, very prosperous, growing, stable, exciting industry, public transportation. It continues to prosper. It continues to evolve, as we all know. Nothing stays the same, but it's a great industry in good health. It continues to grow. Ridership, of course, continues to be a concern for all of us as we've seen ridership dip over the last couple of years. I know many of you on your systems are taking actions to try and bend that curve the other direction. I think those are going to bear fruit. A lot of you are reimagining your networks and your system and making adjustments as you go. A number of places we've seen ridership has dropped, but others we've seen it grow, and others that have been steady across some of the critical modes, of course, of bus and rail. But more importantly, I want to make sure that you don't forget the fact, and we shouldn't forget, that over the last 20-year period, the use of public transportation has increased by over 30%. And in that same period of time, U.S. population has grown by some 22%. So we've had here a track record of continued growth over a long period of time. We're in a bit of a decline and a dip, but we're all working hard to make sure that we can do better than we've done and finding new ways to meet the needs of our riders and our communities. But in communities all across the country, in my travels, and I believe it's true from your own experiences, I've seen it in large and small urban settings, urban and rural. People want more mobility options, and that's what they're demanding today of us, more mobility options. And we see evidence of this all across the country. This year, public transportation won a very impressive set of ballot measure wins. 30 out of 36 ballot measures passed for public transportation. I don't think that's something that we can just gloss over. Think about that for a moment. 30 out of 36, an 83% win record of people going to the voting booth, voting for a ballot measure to raise their own taxes to support public transportation. We should all take great pride in that, be happy about it. Yesterday I was in the transit board members meeting for a while, and I had a chance to talk to a few of the board members from Tampa, from Hillsborough County. And of course, they were ecstatic about the win in Tampa. And perhaps as many of you, I have watched Florida over many years and have been disappointed that they had not been able to seem to pass a ballot measure. And of course, Hillsborough passes it, very significant one in the Tampa Bay region, and Broward County, Fort Lauderdale also passed one. Huge amounts of money. We're talking about $150 to $300 million a year in those communities for public transportation. So people are understanding what the importance is of what we do and what we deliver. Alongside of that, a recent national poll found that 74% of Americans want Congress to increase federal investment in our industry in public transportation. That's a significant number as well. So reflect on that for a minute. We all hear about the dislocation, the discussions, the differing opinions, the things that divide us as a nation on whatever issue. It's so hard to find that there's absolute agreement on any one issue today. But yet, 3/4 of the public agree that increasing investment in public transportation is a good idea and support it. That's pretty remarkable. So while we get bombarded with all kinds of information and happenings around the country and the world, we should keep in mind that we've got a strong industry. It's doing well. The people, where it counts the most, understand the importance of investment in public transportation. And that's really one of the main reasons why we had the bipartisan support in Congress this past year to support increased funding for public transit. Our fiscal year appropriation was the highest it's ever been. $13.5 billion for federal transit programs and another $3.2 billion for commuter and passenger rail. So over $16 billion for our industry at the federal level. Is that enough? Of course not. We know that the needs are much greater, and we have tremendous needs as they relate to state of good repair and system expansion. but the fact that a bipartisan Congress recognizes the importance and has passed that appropriations is quite significant. They're not just numbers, and we understand that as well. These are vital resources to each of you in your own communities as you go about planning your services, delivering improved and expanded service, making the kinds of capital investments that your communities are expecting. So what's ahead as we look to 19? Well, first of all, in the month that lies ahead, we still are under a continuing resolution at the federal level for fiscal 19 appropriations. We're hopeful that Congress will conclude that in the near term here as they conclude all their spending bills. But with a little bit of luck, we should end up at the 18 levels or very, very close to them, which would be another big victory for public transit in terms of our federal appropriations level. So that's a very good news piece for us to build on. And no surprise, reauthorization is just around the corner in 2020, and we're already hard at work to develop those operating principles that will guide us in terms of what we seek from Congress in terms of a renewed FAST Act. So let me talk a little bit about what's ahead here for us as APTA coming up in the industry. First, both political parties, the Congress and the White House, are again talking about infrastructure. It's very significant. There's significant, serious discussions that are going on about the importance and the need to invest in an infrastructure bill, not only for transportation and transit, but beyond that. As we know, I wouldn't go out dancing in the halls or making any celebratory walks, because we know that the big issue that's still hovering over all of us is how are we going to pay for that? And that's what Congress has to wrestle with. But the fact that they're talking about infrastructure investment, they're talking about transportation, we're in the ball game, and that's what we want to know, and we've got our work cut out for us to making sure that we communicate that to all of our stakeholders. But APTA is planning around that a major outreach to the new Congress in January, and we'll be eager to meet with the new chairman of the House T&I Committee, Peter DeFazio. He's a friend of transit. We know him well. He supports what we do. He's eager to move forward on some kind of infrastructure bill, with transit being a very key component. So we've got additional meetings that we'll be looking for to have with him and his team as we begin to have really conversations in earnest. Second, the prospects are looking good, as I mentioned, for FY19. Let me underscore the importance of that. You know, our strategy has been, if we can nail down a very successful FY18 appropriations, which we have done, if we can nail down as successful fiscal 19 appropriations, which we're close to, it sets a nice bar for us in terms of making our arguments for reauthorization, and we're very close to that. We're already, as I mentioned, laying the groundwork for 2020 in terms of the reauthorization. At the committees, the Legislative Steering Committee and the Legislative Committee at large is hard at work in terms of that work effort. If you're able to be with us for the Leg Committee tomorrow, I would urge you to do so. Your voice is important in terms of setting the direction for where we're going. And again, our priorities are very, very clear. We want a multi-year bill, robust funding that addresses state of good repair, so we can maintain our systems reliably, system expansion, which is necessary for communities to keep growing, and to continue to invest in safety and security, workforce initiatives, and of course technology. Those are the things that drive our industry. Fourth, we need to continue to position our industry, public transit, to be the essential backbone in a highly integrated, a modern, multimodal transportation network. That's really where we fit in and where we do the best at what we deliver. APTA has a very essential role in that. We're working hard to help our agencies pivot to the new future that's really here. And we need to make sure that we're not only ready, but we're actively moving forward with new initiatives, new options, new ways to deliver services to our customers and to our communities. So accordingly, we at APTA have launched a very ambitious mobility action plan. Art Gazzetti, who's sitting right here in the front, has taken on a new expanded role, and that is to lead up our mobility initiatives in every respect. It's going to mean for us internally at APTA that we work in a much more cross-cutting way across our departments, but most importantly, that we serve you by providing you valuable information, the latest information, not only what's happening across the U.S., but what's happening internationally. And so we've established in that regard, with this action plan, a mobility innovation hub. And it will be an online portal that you as a member will be able to go to get the absolute latest information of what's happening in mobility across the board, across the U.S., across internationally, to give you the tools that you need to be able to make the kinds of decisions and judgments, again, to better serve your community. So whether it's through automation, whether it's through electrification, whether it's through personalized mobility services, I think you would all agree, our industry is being totally redefined. We're reinventing ourselves in terms of who we are. And we're not alone in this. If we ever think, my gosh, why is transit and why is transportation kind of the centerpiece of this? The fact is, every industry is being disrupted today. Every industry. And later this morning, we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So I believe, and I hope that you agree with me, that those who embrace the change that is happening, the changes that are happening, will become stronger in the process because we're smart enough to figure out how to position ourselves. Ones that deny that that's happening or defer or delay, I'm afraid we're going to be left behind if that's the approach and the perspective. So we need to demonstrate each and every day that we're creating value in our communities every single day. That's how we earn the public's trust and their support, and we've got a good foundation to build on. As I just mentioned, 83% of the ballot measures voted in favor of public transportation, but they have a very reasonable expectation. What are you going to do? How are you going to invest that money? Are you going to invest it so these are worthwhile projects and service initiatives that make sense for our community? And I'm going to use a term that I really love because I think it capsulizes what we're about, and it's future ready. All of what we're doing and what we need to do is to help make our industry future ready. So it's a time that I think more than any time in the past really demands that we come together as a unified organization, industry, looking to achieve common goals. There's a lot of diversity in this room, in our industry, in terms of small and large, urban and rural, bus and rail and multimodal and the like. We have more in common than we have differences here. So we need to be working together, ultimately with one voice, to go to Hill, go to Congress, make our case as strongly as we can for increased investment in public transportation. Our communities are demanding it. Never take the notion that, well, the locals are all stepping up, they're passing these ballot measures, the federal investment isn't necessary. The contrary is true. Locals have come around to believe and accept the fact that they too need to step up to make investments in transit, with the understanding that the federal partner that's been there now for decades will continue. So that partnership, local, state, and federal, must continue if we're going to get the level of investment that's needed to really make a difference in our communities. State of good repair, $90 billion backlog in our industry. Expansion projects that are in the pipeline, in the planning stages, that need to move forward. The federal investment is vitally important. So you're here again at a great time. Pleased that you've joined us. Thank you for not only being here, but thank you for your active engagement. And I often use that word as well. Look, I'm not APTA. David Stackrow, our chair, isn't APTA. You're APTA. We're APTA. So unless we take it personal that we have to be actively engaged in what, quote, APTA does, we're not going to get there. But if we do, we have a heck of a chance to achieve our goals and to move forward as an industry. So with that, thanks again, and it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our chair, David Stackrow.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good morning. Welcome to Washington, D.C. I know some of us have been already engaged in a full day of activities already, but glad you're here early this morning for this opening session, and couldn't be a more exciting time to be involved in public transportation. In Paul's remarks, he spoke about the importance of positioning public transit to be the backbone of a modern, integrated, multimodal mobility network. We need to write our future. And if we're going to redefine the future, we better have a solid strategic plan to guide our way. It must be dynamic as well as pragmatic and aspirational. So APTA will spend the next year listening to our members, soliciting ideas, and crafting a new 3-year strategic plan through a process that reflects our diverse hopes and our shared values. This will mean re-examining APTA's mission and vision and taking a fresh look at what we need to accomplish for a vibrant, successful future. APTA's board will be engaged in a discussion at the end of this week at our board meeting, asking the board directly for their input on mission and vision for APTA's future. This is your opportunity to share not just APTA's future, but to reinvent the public transportation industry. There will be listening sessions scheduled in the coming months at major APTA events, so please tell us your views on the next strategic plan and goals. When we complete our work about a year from now, it will be the beginning, not the end. We need to own it, we need to live it, and we need to make it central to the work of APTA and every APTA committee. One area that we already know will require intense focus is workforce development. APTA continuously improves and expands its professional development programs to meet the industry's needs. Moving forward, we plan to offer more online learning resources, explore the business case for industry certification and credentialing, showcase the best of industry practices, and build a website portal that will serve as the industry's go-to resource for learning and development opportunities. Investing in a skilled, knowledge-based workforce is essential to advancing the emerging shared mobility paradigm. As industry leaders, transit CEOs, transit board members, and business executives, we have an obligation to stay informed and to inform others, to think big and to act boldly, to experiment and to explore, and to share within the industry the lessons that we learn. Our membership is large, diverse, and sometimes we can be boisterous. That's a good thing. It's one of our strengths, but to make our size and our variety real advantages, we need to deliver unified positions. We need to work together, to stick together, to support each other, and most importantly, to speak with one voice. I said it at our annual meeting this past fall. We need to put our passion for public transportation before our parochial interests. Our industry, every part of public transportation, has a powerful narrative to share, a narrative with a wide range of ideas, innovations, and accomplishments. The events this week are proof of that. We all have stories that can teach and inspire because the work that industry leaders are doing right now will define what public transportation becomes. In fact, showcasing our members' exceptional efforts is at the heart of how I view my role as APTA Chair. My year as APTA Chair is about serving you, telling your stories, and advancing goals that are worthy of our collective mission. This event offers a wonderful opportunity to move our industry and APTA into a new position of strength and influence. I thank you for being here. I know it's a tough time the week after Thanksgiving, but I thank you for being here and for helping us to make this a special week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker this morning. David Zipper is a fellow in the Urban and Regional Policy Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. The focus of his work is on urban and mobility innovation. His perspective on urban development is rooted in his experiences working within City Hall, as well as being a venture capitalist, policy researcher, and startup advocate. Mr. Zipper was the managing director for Smart Cities and Mobility at 1776, a global entrepreneurial hub with more than 1,300 member startups concentrated in life-critical sectors like transportation, energy, health, and education. In this role, He connected hundreds of entrepreneurs to urban leaders eager to deploy their solutions, and he closed millions of dollars in partnerships with cities and corporations worldwide. Mr. Zipper also served as the Director of Business Development and Strategy within the Mayor's office in Washington, D.C., under Mayors Vincent Gray and Adrian Fenty. And before moving to Washington, he was the Executive Director of New York City Business Solutions in New York City under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Please join me in welcoming David Zipper.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction, David. Earlier, Paul mentioned, I was taking notes on this, about how transit across the country right now is being redefined and being reinvented because of the rise of technology and the rapid evolution of technology. And I think that's really true. And this morning I'll have a chance to share with you some of my thoughts about what those changes look like and some ideas for how agencies and the transit industry might respond to it. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that that other sectors have gone through this before. Disruption's been going on for 20 plus years in many sectors, and there are lessons that we can get from them. So I actually want to start not with public transportation, but actually want to start in a sector that may feel totally unrelated, which is independent bookstores. I am from North Carolina originally. I was back at home in Chapel Hill, where I grew up over the holidays, and one of my oldest friends started and still runs an independent bookstore in downtown Durham. And he sort of educated me on the sort of U-shaped fall and then rebound of independent bookstores over the last 20 years. And this is, I think, a really interesting narrative. Independent bookstores, of course, were everywhere, in every neighborhood, in every town through the early 90s, for decades, even centuries in this country. And then in mid-1990s, bookstores or book selling was really the first sector that Amazon focused on, right? And we'll remember that time in the late 90s when from 95 to 2000, literally 43% of independent bookstores just poof, went out of business. And things didn't get better then, they got worse. Because a few years after that is when you started having the Kindle and the Nook. Remember that period when a lot of people were saying, this is probably it. You can say goodbye to independent bookstores being a linchpin of American neighborhoods and towns. But that isn't what happened. That really isn't what happened at all. What actually happened was, with their backs against the wall, bookstore managers and owners recognized that there were actually certain assets they had, some characteristics they had, that were really unique and incredibly powerful. For example, only at a bookstore, a neighborhood bookstore, can you have a book reading with your neighbors, can you have a gathering, a community gathering being held? You can't do that online in anywhere near the same way. And there's also that great sense of pride that comes with going to shop at a neighborhood bookstore that people don't feel the same way when they buy a book online. And so those elements became a real focus of a reimagining of what a neighborhood bookstore could look like. And from 2007 to 2016, really against everyone's expectation, the number of independent bookstores in this country has grown by 40%. And I bring that up because I think it's an illustrative example about how a disrupted industry can come back actually stronger than ever before by recognizing some hidden assets and some opportunities that may not have been fully recognized. And I think there may be some lessons there for transit. But and with that, actually, let's dive into transit. So first, real quick, I don't need to go over this. David was very kind, probably overly kind, in going through my background. But suffice to say, I've done a lot of work with startups and with cities. I was here in Washington in the mayor's office, leading economic development strategy when both bike share and ride hail launched. So I have many war stories I can share over a drink sometime. And now I write a lot about the future of urban mobility and the future of cities in the Atlantic City Lab and Fast Company and in some other platforms as well. So it's those experiences that really inform the perspectives that I have as I now am a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund, the think tank that David mentioned. And I've had a chance to share some of my ideas around urban mobility with some of you before because APTA was kind enough to invite me to moderate a series of sessions during the Mobility Summit on July 11th that took place here in Washington. I'm just curious, how many of you were here for that? A quick show of hands. Not that many. It looks like maybe 20% of the hands are going up. But this was really the first event of its kind, as I understand that APTA has done, where we really sort of dove into, in front of it was a sold-out audience. I think 250 plus people were there, standing room only. We had a whole series of conversations about the future of mobility with both public and private leaders, talking about disruption and how to handle it. And one thing I really appreciated about APTA and the instructions I was given to get ready for that event was I was told, lean into discomfort. Some of these questions are going to be difficult to find answers to. There'll be some controversy, and there are going to be some awkward conversations even, but that's important. And I think that's exactly the right perspective because, to be honest, not every transit agency is going to have the same approach to how to handle this, and certainly there could be some differences in the incentives or approaches that some in the private sector may have with transit agencies. But I think it's important to have that kind of perspective, and I know that was the beginning of what I think is going to be a real focus on mobility, as both David and Paul mentioned, for the coming year with APTA. So I'm going to just give a sort of shortened version of a few remarks that I gave on July 11th. I've put a couple different spins on it, and then I have want to go deeper into my perspectives on what some of these changes in technology and transit and urban mobility really mean and what should be done about it. But just to ground things, I always think it's important to recognize just for how long the modes of transportation in cities really stayed the same. There were a fixed number of ways to get around an American city in 1960 that were largely the same in 2000, right? You could take public transportation, a bus or a train or a streetcar, what have you. You could walk, you could drive, you could maybe take a bike or take a taxi, but it was largely the same set of modes for decades. That has really changed. And in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this emergence, this flowering of new mobility modes that are often private sector run, usually private sector driven. From car share at first, with Zipcar emerging, to bike share, to electric bike share, which many, including me, would argue is a different mode entirely, to scooter share, and now there's even new modes coming up like, I don't know if you've seen these electric unicycles called one-wheels. Like, who knows what's coming next? But these new modes have been popping up so quickly and becoming really widespread. Already in San Francisco, 20% of vehicle miles traveled are going to be on ride-hail instead of on people driving their own cars or in taxis. And it's a lot of change, and from a transit perspective, I think there's a real debate about whether this is a change for the good or a change for the bad. It could be that there's now more competition from new modes that could be an issue with ridership, or it could be really good because because now there's more ways to get around a city that could induce people to not rely on a private vehicle, which is something that would really lift all boats. That's a whole other issue, which that debate, which I'm not going to go deeply into. We can discuss it later if you want to. But what I really want to do is, for at least a few minutes, talk about what I think are some of the most important trends that these new technologies or new modes have emerged that are facing transit at the moment. And I want to start with multimodal trips. This is, a huge opportunity potentially to use ride-hail or scooter share or bikes to reach a bus or reach a train. There was already a study that showed that of people who use transit in this country daily, fully 10% of them are also using ride-hail daily to get to and from their workplace. So this is already happening a lot. That said, there's real questions about whether the multimodal incentive exists across all modes of transit equally. One study out of UC Davis showed that there was an uptick in rail ridership when new mobility services emerged, but that's not really seen to be the case with bus ridership, which may be more of in direct competition. The complete streets movement, I think this is so important. I would imagine almost everyone here is going to be familiar with complete streets, but this is a term that's really caught on in such a deep way, especially in city halls. The idea being that maybe our goal as we think about mobility in cities shouldn't be just to move cars as quickly as possible through our cities, but to actually create places where people want to live and be and hang around for a little while. And it leads to a reimagining of what streetscapes can look like, of allocation of street lanes for bikes, for pedestrians, for buses, which is a huge impact. Potentially, this is a very powerful trend for public transit, But the issue is a lot of the people who are behind this movement are actually not in transit agencies, they're in city halls with different responsibilities, which I think is something that I'll come back to, but it's a trend that certainly has a deep impact on transit. And now I want to dive into some of what I think are important ramifications to transit that come from the new technology services themselves. Uber, Lyft, Lime, Bird, these new mobility service companies are sort of native to mobile, if you're familiar with that term, which means they were born out from people who have smartphones. So you think about if you have a Lyft app on your phone, how often are you getting an update on it? Like every, 3 weeks or something like that? And just think about how often a transit app is going to be updated with new services, new designs, make it a little bit more user-friendly. Probably not that frequently, almost certainly not that frequently. And I think that's actually a real issue because there's, in my view, an emerging expectation, especially from young people, that because they're used to using these apps to get a Lime scooter or an Uber ride hail, they expect a certain degree of tech sophistication when they're planning a trip or buying a ticket and they want to see from their transit agency as well. I think that's an issue to keep in mind too. Data, this is a big one. I won't delve into it too deeply, but suffice to say that transit agencies rely on data to do planning, to optimize services, and there's now a whole array of new data that's being created by these private mobility services. How that's captured, whether we even have access to it, is a really big question. But I also think it's worth asking if transit agencies could get all the data they ever wanted from ride hail, from bike share, from scooters, what would they use it for? Not every person I've spoken to has a great answer for that. I think it's worth thinking through that too. Flexibility. With all these new technologies emerging, it would seem intuitive that as a transit agency leader, you want to be able to have sort of a plug-and-play approach. You want to be able to try out something new, bring it into your infrastructure. Maybe it's a new solution to improve real-time identification of where the buses and the trains are. Maybe it's an integration of a ticket payment process with an adjacent transit agency or with a private mobility service. If we have long-term procurements for transit agencies with really expensive change orders, it's really hard to have that kind of agility and flexibility that's necessary. And in my mind, it makes it difficult for transit agencies to adapt for new mobility services. And then we come to one called walled gardens. I'm just curious, is this a term that anyone's familiar with? A show of hands? I see about 6 people putting their hands up bravely. It's an important business model for tech companies that's coming to urban mobility. And the best way to explain it is to actually give an example. If you have an iPhone or a Mac, you are using the Apple Store, which is its own walled garden. You have to go to the Apple Store to get apps, right? To get updates. And Apple curates your experience when you're there. It'll bring some apps to your attention. It will maybe not allow certain apps to be available at all. It manages the whole experience for you. That's a walled garden. It's a very powerful model. Kindle is another good example of that. Facebook could be an example too. And this is actually the direction, pretty explicitly, that Uber and Lyft want to go, as well as some other new mobility services programs as well. The CEO of Uber has said, I want Uber to be the Amazon of transportation. Don't just go to Uber to get ride hail, go to Uber to get scooters or to get a bike and to get potentially public transit. I think it's a big question how public transit leaders should think about that sort of what I would think of as disintermediation, where they basically are a service within another app, because this is pretty explicitly the direction that at least Uber and Lyft and potentially some of the other companies as well want to go in. And finally, governance. I was just talking with Nat Ford from Jacksonville about this because he has experience working in San Francisco, which is an anomaly a little bit among North American cities in that all the various transportation agencies and transit are going to be within SFMTA. Ordinarily, you have a transit agency separate from these other mobility functions within a city, and some of them are going to be state functions as well, such as ride-hail regulation. But if we're going to charge transit agencies with these mobility goals of reducing congestion and ensuring safety, providing equity, and a lot of other players are going to be involved in doing that, including potentially these new mobility services, is it worth rethinking governance structures and think a little bit more about an expanding role of perhaps a transit authority, of the model that, to my knowledge, only San Francisco and Vancouver in North America really have, maybe LA a little bit. And then, of course, if you think that's a lot of change, only more is going to be coming. Autonomous vehicles I haven't even mentioned yet. There was a study that the World Economic Forum and BCG put out focusing on Boston that projected that due to autonomous vehicles, the share of trips within Boston in 2030 that would be taken on public transportation was going to drop from 43% down to 33% in the next 12 years. That's a projection. We'll see if it's true or not. But if that is going to happen, it obviously is going to have a deep impact on public transit. So, those were some thoughts in sort of a bit of a different version that I shared in July, which was not that long ago. It was only 4 months ago. But just to show just how quickly this field is evolving, I wanted to pull just a few headlines of what I think is some of the most interesting stories that happened just in those last 4 months in new mobility. And here's just a few that I grabbed. You actually can see these better than I will, so hopefully I can go through them one by one. But just in the last 4 months, Uber and Lyft have rolled out 2 really big new programs. One is a subscription service where you can pay up front to have either a fixed amount of Lyft rides or a discounted group of Uber rides. And they've also rolled out rewards programs, like a frequent flyer program. This is potentially a big deal. It's an effort to get customer loyalty. But one thing that I think is really noteworthy is that Uber Rewards, which is their version of it, gives more rewards per dollar spent if you take Uber XL or Uber X than if you take Uber Pool, which is the one where you're sharing your ride. It's an interesting impact that would have on congestion, but we can talk about that separately. And there's other things that have happened too. We've started to see technology companies get into the ride-hail business more directly, with Google going head-to-head with Lyft and Uber by announcing an autonomous taxi service in Arizona. We've seen Lime become more multimodal by launching not just a bike and scooter share service, but a car share service as well. And we've seen the car company Ford start to dip its toes into these waters as well. They spent $100 million, Ford did, to buy Spin, one of the one of the largest, most broadly deployed bike share and scooter share companies in the United States. This is a very confusing sector to follow, and there's a lot happening at once. And then just yesterday, literally yesterday, I pulled this headline. Bird, another scooter share and bike share company, announced a platform play where now if you, any entrepreneur or bike shop can work with Bird to get a whole fleet of Bird scooters deployed to probably a mid-sized town or city and manage it with Bird getting a little bit of a share of the fee of the rides. So this actually could bring scooter share to many mid-sized cities that I don't think have had it yet. The point is, this sector is evolving really, really fast. So, what to make of this? There's a lot of information I just sort of threw at you. And I was trying to think about how to sort of offer some thoughts to sort of bring sense of it and hopefully be constructive. And what I thought I would do is spend a few minutes offering the perspective, as I understand it, of some of the major players that are now involved in urban mobility that haven't been historically. And then I'll talk about I'll end with some thoughts about what this could mean for transit itself. But I spent a lot of time with the private sector in this space as well, so I want to share with you my perspective on what they're thinking, and hopefully this will help you sort of have a lens through which to read the news and to follow what's going on. And first, to think about the perspective of new mobility services. I think to understand why Uber and Lyft are doing what they're doing right now, you have to understand they want to go public. And they're kind of in a race to go public. And when you have that in mind, it sort of makes sense that they're so focused on, for example, a subscription model or these rewards programs, because Wall Street smiles upon companies that have reliable income streams, and subscriptions are certainly those reliable revenues that they're looking for. It also makes sense, again, why Uber and Lyft would look to sort of expand into adjacent modes beyond ride-hail, to take a bigger chunk of the mobility wallet, if you will, to look at bikes and look at scooter share and perhaps transit as well as adjacencies that, again, if they can get traction there, Wall Street could smile upon it. And I think it's worth thinking about scooters too, because they're becoming a really big deal in this space as well, Lime and Bird being the biggest ones. They're in a different situation. They've received hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital money, but unlike Uber and Lyft, they haven't scaled that broadly yet. So they have to get bigger, and they have to expand. And there have been some scuffles in various cities that I'm sure many of you are familiar with as the scooters have launched. But I think it actually could get much worse if, like here in Washington, cities adopt policies where there's an artificially low cap on the number of scooters that can be deployed. Here it's now 600 per company, which is in the mind of these companies not nearly enough to be sustainable. And keep in mind, these are VC-backed companies that have to scale according to their funders. So I expect if there's more pushback we see from cities against the scaling of bike share and of scooter share, we may actually see more conflict and more contention in 2019. That's something that I think could happen. And then finally, I just wanted to spend a moment talking about how I think these companies view transit, which is obviously a perspective that we care a lot about. If you talk to leaders at Lyft or Bird or any of these companies, they're going to say they love transit because we're all on the same side of trying to get people out of their cars and to stop driving themselves alone to and from their places of work or around town. And that's true. It is true. Just keep in mind as well, transit represents millions and millions of people who could potentially be riders on these private mobility services as well. And every now and then there's something that happens where there's a little bit of a slip up where there is that conflict that you just have to keep in mind. Like for example in the New York City where when the subway was having some operational problems, Lyft briefly had some ads up that said, do you really want to be riding the subway? Take Lyft instead. Now then Lyft apologized, so we didn't mean to do that, but it's something to keep in mind. You see those ads? They weren't pretty. So some perspectives on new mobility services there. Then I want to talk a little about car manufacturers, because this is an interesting one to me. Car manufacturers have not historically had a lot of interactions with cities. I know this because I worked with Bloomberg's administration in New York and in Washington, D.C. mayor's office for a couple mayors, and we just had basically no interaction with them practically. But that's changing, and it's changing because car companies are nervous, and they're looking to cities as one of the big areas that's making them nervous. When I graduated high school in 1996, 85% of seniors got a driver's license. Today it's down to 71% and it's falling. And particularly in cities, the number of people who, like myself actually, have given up their cars and are relying on a combination of transit and new mobility services is growing. That is worrisome, and it's led to a lot of pressure on them to understand these car companies to think about how cities operate. Remember I mentioned Ford acquiring Spin, the bike share company. That's not an accident. I think every car company I can think of now has a smart mobility division. There's Ford Smart Mobility, there's GM's Maven, there's BMW's Drive Now. You sort of have to have it. And these services are knocking on the door of city halls in a way that just didn't happen even a few years ago, and offering potentially a lot of resources. It was striking to me that Ford, I believe their program is called City on a Hill, they are providing millions of dollars in free services to Miami, Grand Rapids, Pittsburgh, to help think about multimodal transportation, because Ford wants to learn. There's self-interest in here for Ford, because these car companies are starting from they're starting a little bit further back in terms of their knowledge base. And it's also, I think, it provides, when you understand that in my view, it's actually fear that they have, it puts a different spin on their focus on autonomous vehicle development as well. Because if it is true that people in cities are going to move away from owning cars in the future, one way that these car companies can mitigate that loss of revenue is if we now have a big autonomous vehicle fleet moving us around in taxis or shuttles, what have you, that the car companies can create. That's a diversification for them. Now, whether that compensates fully for the potentially lost revenue, I don't know, but I think it's worth keeping in mind what I think is a real sense of consternation and concern that the car companies have. And then the last perspective I wanted to offer before we get to transit is one of cities. I work with a lot of mayors, a lot of city officials, and I think it's worth just mentioning some of the perspectives I hear a lot from them. And for one thing, you hear a lot about Vision Zero. I imagine most folks here are going to be familiar with it. Mayors love Vision Zero. It's the goal of having zero fatalities for pedestrians, bicyclists, and drivers. It's a great thing to get behind. It's a lot harder politically if you're a mayor or a DOT director to make the tough decisions that can lead to lower fatalities, like greater speed limits, like allocating a lane of street space for bus rapid transit. There's a real tension there, and we've seen it here. Actually, again, I'll just mention Washington, it's a city I know well. There have been 31 deaths so far this year of pedestrians and bicyclists. despite a Vision Zero program, the deaths have gone up, and there's been a lot of frustration in the advocacy community around that. So understand that there's a tension there. The other point I want to make is that I think there's a growing interest, in this, or an awareness, I should say, that it's hard to for transit agencies to be responsible for the future of mobility in a region if they don't control the streets, they don't control ride hail, they don't control new mobility services, all these other elements that play a big role. And there's the alternative model of, say, San Francisco and Vancouver, where it's consolidated in one agency. Interestingly, though, the biggest pushback against that consolidation of responsibility comes often from elected officials, and from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, from mayors in British Columbia, who want that direct accountability, want that direct responsibility. I see Nat nodding, so hopefully I'm on target with this. But I think that's important to keep in mind as well. I expect that there's going to be more interest in this consolidation model going forward, and it'll be really interesting to see how city leaders respond to it. And the last point I want to make about cities' perspectives from what I hear is understand, remember I mentioned how the car companies and tech companies are going to City Hall in a way they didn't before. That can be quite seductive. It didn't happen when I was in City Hall 5 years ago. It does now, and I do think there is a risk of city leaders sort of falling a little bit in love with the future of technology at the expense of transit. I know there was an example in South Florida of a local leader saying, I don't know about needing light rail, AVs are going to take care of that. That's not true, but I think it is a risk that we need to be aware of, this sort of fetishization of technology, which is something I always try to keep in mind, and I think it's worth all of us doing that as well. So those are some perspectives that I hope are constructive and illuminating about how some other agents are thinking about the future of mobility in this space. But of course, I do think I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think are constructive approaches for transit itself. And I have a series of questions here that I think are just really important to keep in mind for those who are running a transit agency or thinking about the future of transit. And there's a series of them here. And the first is sort of existential, honestly. But to ask yourself as a transit leader, are you an operator of transit assets, like buses and rail, or are you a mobility platform? And what I mean by that is, if, let's say, a person decides to commute not by driving, but by taking, say, a scooter to and from work, is that a good thing for your agency? Because if it is, you've just adopted a broader vision of success that goes beyond simple ridership or budgetary outcomes. It's really looking at overall regional outcomes of your mobility system, which I think is really important and potentially existential. And that leads right to the next question here, which is, do you take into account with your strategy how people decide how to move? And what I mean by this goes back to the user experience, I think is so fundamental. And I'll use myself as an example here, because I think I'm like a lot of people in this way. Like, if I'm really honest, how would I, in an ideal world, like to travel? I'd love to have some sort of a vehicle come right to where I am, pick me up, maybe my companion too, go right to where I'm going, and I get out there. Maybe I drive myself, maybe a personal vehicle gives me that privacy to do it, so forth and so on. I mean, I think it's human nature to think that's ideal. The problem is, if we all do that, no one's getting anywhere, right? We're just stuck in traffic the entire time. But if we want transit not to be a mode of last resort for those who can't afford any other mode, I think it's so important to understand that basic human mentality, which is, what is the fastest, most convenient way for me to get around? And that's where I at least come, and this is a broad conversation, but I think it's important for an agency leader to have a perspective on it. I come back to this issue of speed. How can we make transit faster than any other mode? Maybe you take away some parking so that the option of driving myself is a little bit less desirable. You create exclusive bus corridors so that it's actually faster to take bus than any other route. But having that user-focused approach, to me, is absolutely key to winning over the customers or commuters who have a growing array of options to navigate a city. And then, how you align your strategy with the city and state behind you? Well, quite intuitively, if your focus as an agency is to say, well, we want to make our buses go faster, and that will be more competitive with alternative modes, well, that's great, but if you don't control the streets, you're going to need to have the city or the state or both behind you in order to be able to provide that faster service that you want to. All-door boarding and the things that you can control yourself only go so far. Then number 4 here is, and I mentioned this before with the walled garden slide, are you okay being disintermediated by a mobility company? Like Uber and Lyft very clearly would love to have transit ticketing be available as an option within their app. Are you comfortable with that? Do you want to maintain that direct relationship with your customers? Maybe you'd prefer to have those companies inside your own app. I have not talked to a lot of transit leaders who have a really clear perspective on this yet, but I think it's a really important question to ask. And then the last one is, how can you surprise and delight your customers? Like I mentioned, the rewards program that Uber and Lyft are getting. I would love to see transit agencies have rewards programs too. Why not? Provide merchant discounts. Like, you took transit 4 times this week. Here's a cup of coffee that our partner at X coffee shop will provide to you. Or here's another kind of upgrade. I think this is a customer orientation that's really, really important, because these other private modes that I've talked about, it's in their own DNA. That customer experience is just so important. And then the last point I made down here is, and don't lose sight of what makes transit unique. Because I really think there is so much that makes transit unique. I started by talking about independent bookstores and how over the last 20 years there's been a recognition on their part of what they really have that nobody else can compete with, this community connection, the opportunity to host events. I mean, in my mind, I don't know how we can have the societal outcomes that we want in cities and regions around equity, around pollution reduction, around congestion reduction, without robust transit. Like, that to me is the real differentiator. I don't always think that people fully appreciate that. I think that may be, at least is my thought of what of those key differentiators could be that really allows transit to to stand aside and thrive in the years ahead. I'm going to stop there. I could go on much longer on a lot of these topics, but I hope I'll have a chance to talk with you about them, or some of you about them going forward. I'm going to be working with APTA and their new mobility work quite a bit in the future. But feel free to contact me. You can reach me through the website listed right there. But I hope I at least gave you something to think about, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.